Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. The city of Chicago was never more alive than at night. The streets pulsed with energy, the skyscrapers gleamed like diamonds, and the subway system hummed with activity. But for Jack Harris, a security guard working the graveyard shift at the 95th Street subway station, the night was just another long, tedious stretch of hours. Jack had worked at the station for 5 years, and he knew every nook and cranny, every hidden corner, and every late-night regular. He knew the engineers who maintained the trains, the janitors who cleaned the platforms, and the police officers who patrolled the streets above. But despite his familiarity with the station, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the cold wind that howled through the tunnels like a chorus of restless spirits. Maybe it was the flickering fluorescent lights that cast eerie shadows on the walls. Whatever it was, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That unblinking eyes were trained on him from the darkness. He shrugged it off as mere paranoia and continued his rounds, checking the platforms, the tunnels, and the trains. The station was quiet. The only sound, the distant rumble of a train and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and died, plunging the station into darkness. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he fumbled for his flashlight. He clicked it on, casting a weak beam of light down the tunnel, and that's when he saw it. A train, pulling into the station, its cars gleaming like silver bullets in the darkness. But something was wrong. The train was arriving, after hours, and there was no one in the driver's seat. Jack's eyes were fixed on the train as it pulled into the station. It was an old train, with cars that seemed to date back to the 1970s. But it was the fact that it was arriving after hours, with no one in the driver's seat, that really caught Jack's attention. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he approached the train. The cars were empty, the seats vacant, and the windows dark. But as Jack looked closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The train's headlights were still on, casting an eerie glow over the platform, and the train's engines were still humming, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air. But there was no one on board, no driver, no conductor, no passengers. The train seemed to be operating on its own, as if it were driven by some unseen force. Jack's mind was racing with questions. Who was driving the train? Where was it coming from? And where was it going? He looked up at the station's schedule board, but there was no indication of a train arriving at this time. The board showed the last train of the night had departed hours ago. Jack's skin was crawling with unease. Something was very wrong here. He knew he had to investigate further, but as he approached the train, he felt a strange sense of trepidation. It was as if the train was waiting for him. It's empty, cars and dark windows seeming to stare at him like the eyes of a predator. Jack's heart was racing as he cautiously approached the train. He had never seen anything like this before. The train seemed to be operating on its own, with no signs of life anywhere. As he drew closer, he noticed that the train's doors were open, inviting him to step inside. Jack hesitated, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Something didn't feel right. The train seemed to be waiting for him, its empty cars and dark windows seeming to stare at him like the eyes of a predator. Despite his reservations, Jack stepped inside the train. The doors creaked shut behind him, and he was plunged into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight and turned it on, casting a weak beam of light down the aisle. The train's interior was old and worn, with faded seats and scratched walls. But it was the air that caught Jack's attention. It was thick and heavy, with a sweet metallic scent that seemed to cling to his skin. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing off the walls. The train seemed to be deserted. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he approached the front of the train, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The driver's seat was empty, but on the dashboard, a small sign read, "Last stop, nowhere." Jack's mind was racing with questions. What did the sign mean? Where was the train going? And what was waiting for him at the end of the line? As Jack gazed at the sign on the dashboard, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Last stop, nowhere" seemed to mock him, its words echoing in his mind like a sinister mantra. He turned away from the sign, his eyes scanning the train's interior for any other clues. That's when he saw it, a digital display above the doors, flashing a message in cold blue letters. Arrival time, 3 a.m., destination nowhere. Jack's heart sank as he read the message. 3 a.m. was just a few minutes away, and he had no idea what would happen when the train arrived at its destination. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling himself that this was just some kind of prank or malfunction. But deep down, he knew that something was very wrong. The train seemed to be moving of its own accord, carrying him towards a fate that he couldn't understand or control. And Jack was powerless to stop it. As Jack continued to stare at the digital display, he noticed something strange. The words "nowhere" and 3 a.m. seemed to be pulsing with a faint, otherworldly energy. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that this was no ordinary train. The digital display seemed to be more than just a simple sign. It was a portal to another dimension, a gateway to the unknown. Jack's mind was racing with questions. What was this train, and where was it going? What lay at the end of the line, in the place called nowhere? As he pondered these questions, the train suddenly lurched forward, throwing Jack off balance. He stumbled backwards, grabbing onto a nearby seat to steady himself. The digital display flickered and went dark, plunging the train into an eerie silence. Jack was left standing in the darkness, his heart pounding with anticipation. And then, without warning, the lights flickered back to life. The digital display glowed once more, its words pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Arrival time, 2:55 a.m., destination nowhere. Jack's eyes widened as he realized that they were approaching their destination. The train was slowing down, its wheels screeching against the tracks. And then, with a final jolt, the train came to a stop. The doors creaked, open, inviting Jack to step out into the unknown. As the doors creaked open, Jack hesitated for a moment, wondering what lay ahead. He peered out into the darkness, but saw nothing but an endless expanse of shadows. And then, without warning, a figure stepped out of the darkness and onto the train. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized that he was not alone. The figure was tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to bore into Jack's very soul. He was dressed in a long black coat that seemed to swallow him whole. As Jack watched, more figures emerged from the darkness, each one as eerie and unsettling as the last. They filed onto the train, their eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. Jack tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. He was trapped, unable to move or escape. The figures began to move towards him, their eyes burning, with an otherworldly energy. Jack felt a scream rising in his throat, but it was frozen in his vocal cords, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. The train was empty once more, except for Jack. He was left standing, alone, his heart pounding with fear. What had just happened? Who were those figures, and what did they want? As he stood there trying to make sense of it all, Jack heard a faint whispering in his ear. "We're waiting for you," it said. Jack spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the walls of the train. And then the train's doors creaked shut, trapping Jack inside. He was alone, but he knew that he was not alone for long. As the train's doors creaked shut, Jack felt a sense of claustrophobia wash over him. He was trapped, alone and defenseless, with no way to escape. He looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the figures he had seen before. But the train was empty, the seats vacant and the aisles deserted. And then, without warning, the figures began to reappear. They emerged from the shadows, their eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. This time Jack saw them more clearly. They were people, or at least they seemed to be people, but their faces were twisted and distorted, their eyes sunken and their skin pale. They moved towards Jack, their movement slow and deliberate. He tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. As the figures drew closer, Jack saw that they were all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their suits and dresses faded and worn. One of them, a woman with a twisted, cruel smile, reached out and touched Jack's face. Her hand was cold and clammy, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. "Welcome to our train," she whispered, her voice like a rusty gate. "We've been waiting for you." Jack tried to pull away, but the woman's grip was like a vice. He was trapped, unable to move or escape, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. The train was empty once more, except for Jack. He was left standing alone, his heart pounding with fear. What had just happened? Who were those people? And what did they want? As he stood there, trying to make sense of it all, Jack heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the train. They were heavy, deliberate footsteps, and they were getting closer. The footsteps echoed through the train, growing louder with each passing moment. Jack's heart was racing with anticipation, his senses on high alert. He tried to move, to get away from the sound, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. He was trapped, unable to escape. The footsteps stopped right behind him. Jack felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, and he knew that he was not alone. He slowly turned around, his eyes scanning the darkness. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and imposing, standing in the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching Jack with an unblinking gaze. Jack tried to speak, to ask the figure what it wanted. But his voice was frozen in his throat. The figure didn't seem to notice. It just kept watching Jack, its eyes burning with an intense, otherworldly energy. And then, without warning, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped, and the train was silent once more. Jack was left standing alone, his heart pounding with fear. What had just happened? Who was that figure, and what did it want? As he stood there, trying to make sense of it all, Jack heard a faint whispering in his ear. "You're getting close," it said. Jack spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the walls of the train, and then the train's lights flickered and went out, plunging Jack into darkness. The darkness was absolute, a living, breathing entity that seemed to wrap itself around Jack like a shroud. He was blind, unable to see his hand in front of his face. He stumbled forward, trying to find his way through the darkness. But every step felt like a journey into the unknown. He reached out with his hands, trying to feel his way through the darkness. But his fingers closed on nothing but air. The darkness seemed to be shifting and swirling around him, like a living thing. Jack felt like he was being pulled down into its depths, sucked into a vortex of nothingness. He tried to call out, to shout for help, but his voice was swallowed up by the darkness, lost in its endless expanse. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness ended. The lights flickered back to life, and Jack found himself standing in the middle of the train, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the commuter car. But something was off. The train seemed different, somehow. The seats seemed older, the windows grimier, and then, Jack saw it. A figure sitting in the seat across from him. A figure he hadn't noticed before. The figure was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, its face pale and drawn. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine as their eyes met. "Welcome to the train," the figure said, its voice low and gravelly. "I've been waiting for you." Jack tried to speak, to ask the figure what it wanted, but his voice was frozen in his throat. The figure smiled, its eyes glinting with amusement. "Don't worry," it said. "You'll be able to talk soon enough." And with that, the figure reached out and touched Jack's face. Jack felt a jolt of electricity run through his body, and suddenly he could speak. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking with fear. The figure smiled again. "I'm someone who's been on this train for a very long time," it said, "and I'm here to show you the way." As the figure spoke, the train's doors slid open and a group of passengers stepped inside. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and drawn. Jack watched in amazement as the passengers took their seats, their eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. "Who are these people?" Jack asked the figure, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're fellow travelers," the figure replied, its smile growing wider. "We're all on this journey together." As the figure spoke, the passengers began to stir, their eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving hunger. "What do they want?" Jack asked, trying to step back. "They want to show you the way," the figure replied, its voice dripping with menace. "They want to take you to the final destination." Jack's heart was racing with fear. What did the figure mean? What was the final destination? As he looked around at the passengers, Jack saw that they were all staring at him, their eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. He knew that he had to get out of there to escape from the train and its sinister passengers. But as he turned to run, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder holding him back. "You can't leave now," the figure whispered, its breath cold against Jack's ear. "The journey has just begun." As the figure's cold breath whispered against his ear, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only seemed to grow stronger. The passengers were still staring at him, their eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. Jack felt like he was being pulled into their world, a world of darkness and terror, and then he heard it. A whisper, soft and faint, but unmistakable. "Get off the train," the whisper seemed to say. Jack spun around, trying to see who was speaking, but there was no one there. The whisper seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the walls of the train. "Get off the train," it repeated. Jack knew that he had to listen. He knew that he had to get off the train, no matter what. But as he turned to make his way to the door, he felt the figure's cold hand on his shoulder, holding him back. "You can't leave now," the figure whispered, its breath cold against Jack's ear. "The journey has just begun." Jack struggled against the figure's grip, but it was too strong. He was trapped, unable to escape. And then, the train's doors slid shut, trapping Jack inside. The passengers began to stir, their eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. The whisper seemed to fade away, replaced by the sound of the train's engines roaring to life. The journey was continuing, and Jack was powerless to stop it. As the train's engines roared to life, Jack felt a surge of fear and adrenaline. He was trapped, unable to escape, and the train was taking him deeper into the unknown. The passengers seemed to be watching him with an unnerving intensity, their eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. Jack felt like he was being pulled into their world, a world of darkness and terror. The train rumbled on, the scenery outside the windows blurring into a dark and featureless landscape. Jack had no idea where they were going or what lay ahead. The journey continued. The passengers began to stir, their movements slow and deliberate. They seemed to be waiting for something, their eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving anticipation. The figure that had been holding Jack's shoulder seemed to relax its grip, allowing Jack to move freely. But Jack knew that he was still trapped, still at the mercy of the train and its sinister passengers. As the train rumbled on, Jack began to feel a sense of disorientation. The journey seemed to be taking him further and further away from reality, deeper into a world of madness and terror. He stumbled through the train trying to find a way out, but every door he opened led only to more corridors, more carriages, and more passengers. The train seemed to be shifting and changing around him, its layout altering in ways that defied logic and reason. Jack felt like he was trapped in a living nightmare with no escape in sight. And then, just as he thought things couldn't get any worse, Jack heard a voice that seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the walls of the train. "Welcome to the infinite journey," it said. "You'll never leave." As the voice echoed through the train, Jack felt a sense of despair wash over him. He was trapped, stuck on a train that seemed to be taking him on an infinite journey. The passengers seemed to be watching him with an even greater intensity, their eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. Jack felt like he was being pulled into their world, a world of madness and terror. The train rumbled on, the scenery outside the windows blurring into a never-ending landscape of darkness and shadow. Jack had no idea where they were going or what lay ahead. As the journey continued, Jack began to feel a sense of disorientation. Time seemed to be losing all meaning, and he had no idea how long he had been on the train. The passengers seemed to be changing, their faces shifting and morphing into new and terrifying forms. Jack felt like he was trapped in a living nightmare with no escape in sight. And then, just as he thought things couldn't get any worse, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing at the end of the carriage, watching him with an unblinking gaze. It was the conductor, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him as the conductor began to move towards him, his eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. "You're enjoying the ride?" "I hope," the conductor said, his voice dripping with malice, "because it's only just beginning." As the conductor approached him, Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. The conductor's grin seemed to be growing wider, his eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. "You're enjoying the ride, I hope," the conductor repeated, his voice dripping with malice. "Because it's only just beginning." Jack tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The conductor's grin seemed to be hypnotizing him, drawing him in with an unstoppable force. The passengers seemed to be watching the scene with great interest, their eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. Jack felt like he was being pulled into their world, a world of madness and terror. The conductor's grin seemed to be growing wider, his eyes burning with an otherworldly energy. Jack felt like he was being consumed by the conductor's madness, pulled into a world of insanity and terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the conductor's grin seemed to fade away. The conductor's face returned to its normal, impassive state, and Jack felt like he had been released from a spell. But the feeling of unease lingered, and Jack knew that he was still trapped on the train. The conductor seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to make another move. The train rumbled on, the scenery outside the windows blurring into a never-ending landscape of darkness and shadow. Jack had no idea where they were going, or what lay ahead, but he knew that he had to escape, no matter what. He had to find a way off the train before it was too late. As the conductor turned to walk away, Jack knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let himself be trapped on the train forever. He took a deep breath and made a run for the door. The conductor spun around, his eyes narrowing in surprise. But Jack was too quick. He burst through the door and out into the corridor, the conductor's angry shout echoing behind him. Jack didn't look back. He kept running, his feet pounding the floor as he sprinted down the corridor. He could hear the conductor behind him, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Jack knew he had to find a way off the train, and fast. He burst through a door at the end of the corridor and found himself in a dimly lit room. It was small and cramped, with metal walls and a single window. Jack ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck fast, refusing to budge. He was trapped. The conductor appeared in the doorway, his eyes glinting with malice. "You can't escape," he said, his voice dripping with triumph. Jack knew he had to think fast. He looked around the room, desperate for a way out, and then he saw it. A small door, hidden behind a panel in the wall. It was slightly ajar, and Jack could see a sliver of light coming from the other side. Without hesitation, Jack made a dash for the door. He squeezed through the narrow opening and found himself in a long, dark tunnel. He started to run, his feet echoing off the walls of the tunnel. He could hear the conductor behind him, his angry shouts growing fainter with each step. Jack kept running, his heart pounding with excitement. He was escaping. He was finally free. As Jack ran through the tunnel, he could feel the cool air rushing past him, a welcome relief after the stifling atmosphere of the train. He didn't dare look back, fearing what he might see. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness broken only by the faint glow of flickering fluorescent lights. Jack's footsteps echoed off the walls, making it seem like he was being pursued by an army. He kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea where the tunnel led, but he knew he had to keep moving. As he rounded a bend in the tunnel, Jack saw a glimmer of light up ahead. He burst through the final stretch, emerging into a bright, sunlit world. Jack blinked in the bright light, taking a deep breath of fresh air. He looked around, trying to get his bearings. He found himself standing on a deserted platform, the tunnel. He had just emerged from disappearing into the side of a hill. The platform was surrounded by trees, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Jack looked around, trying to see if anyone was watching him. But the platform was deserted, the only sound, the distant hum of a train. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had escaped the train, and he was finally free. But as he turned to walk away from the platform, Jack heard a faint whisper in his ear. "You'll never be free." He spun around, but there was no one there. The platform was still deserted, the only sound the distant hum of a train. Jack's heart sank, and he knew that he was far from safe. Jack's heart was racing as he stood on the platform, trying to make sense of the whisper he had just heard. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. The whisper seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the trees and the platform. Jack felt like he was being watched, and the sensation sent shivers down his spine. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He had escaped the train, and he was finally free. But the whisper seemed to suggest otherwise. As he stood there trying to make sense of the whisper, Jack heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the trees. They were light, cautious footsteps, and they seemed to be getting closer. Jack's heart sank, and he knew that he had to get out of there. He started to run, his feet pounding the platform as he sprinted towards the trees. He burst through the underbrush, his heart racing with fear. He could hear the footsteps behind him getting closer and closer. As he ran, Jack stumbled upon a narrow dirt path. He followed it, his feet pounding the earth as he sprinted through the trees. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing closer together as the canopy overhead grew thicker. Jack could hear the footsteps behind him, but they seemed to be fading into the distance. He kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't dare look back, fearing what he might see. As the path began to climb, Jack's legs started to ache. He was getting tired, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He crested the hill, his lungs burning with exhaustion. And that's when he saw it. A figure standing in the distance, watching him. As Jack crested the hill, he saw the figure standing in the distance, watching him. The figure was tall and imposing, its presence seeming to fill the entire landscape. Jack's heart sank, and he felt a sense of dread wash over him. He tried to take a step back, but his legs seemed rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching Jack with an unblinking gaze. Jack felt like he was being pulled into the figure's world, a world of darkness and terror. As he stood there, frozen with fear, Jack noticed something strange. The figure seemed to be shifting. Its form seemed to be blurring, like it was made of smoke or mist. Jack's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure seemed to be changing, its form morphing into something new, and then, in an instant, the figure vanished. Jack was left standing alone on the hill, his heart pounding with fear. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. He looked around, trying to see if the figure had left any clues behind. That's when he saw it. A piece of paper, lying on the ground where the figure had stood. Jack walked over to it, his heart still racing with fear. He picked up the paper, and on it, he saw a message that made his blood run cold. "You'll never escape." As Jack read the message, he felt a chill run down his spine. "You'll never escape" seemed to leap off the page, the words echoing in his mind like a mantra. He looked around, trying to see if anyone was watching him, but the hill was deserted. The only sound, the rustling of the wind through the trees. Jack's mind was racing. Who had written the message, and what did they mean? Was he trapped in some kind of sinister game? He felt a sense of panic rising up inside him. He had to get out of there, had to find a way back to civilization. But as he turned to leave, he saw something that made his heart sink. The path he had followed to get to the hill was gone. In its place was a dense thicket of brambles and thorns. Jack knew he couldn't go back that way. He was trapped. He looked around, trying to find another way down the hill. But every path he saw seemed to lead to more brambles, more thorns. He was starting to feel desperate. He had to find a way out, had to escape from this nightmare. And then he heard a faint rustling in the bushes. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he wondered what was coming for him next. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the underbrush. It was a woman, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. "Welcome to the maze," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll never find your way out." As the woman spoke, Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. The maze, what did she mean? The woman's grin grew wider as she began to circle around Jack. "You're trapped now," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll never escape." Jack tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The woman's eyes seemed to be hypnotizing him, drawing him deeper into the maze. And then everything went black. When Jack came to, he found himself standing in a long, winding corridor. The walls were made of cold grey stone, and the air was thick with the scent of dampness. He stumbled forward, trying to get his bearings. But every door he opened led only to more corridors, more twists and turns. The maze seemed to be shifting and changing around him, like a living thing. Jack felt like he was being herded towards some unknown fate, trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear and confusion. As he walked, the corridors began to grow darker and more menacing. Jack could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the maze, growing louder with every step. He knew he had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the maze before it was too late. But every door he opened led only to more terror, more confusion. And then Jack saw it, a glimmer of light in the distance, shining like a beacon in the darkness. He stumbled towards it, his heart pounding with hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could escape the maze after all. But as he reached the source of the light, Jack's heart sank. It was only a mirror, reflecting his own terrified face back at him. And then the mirror seemed to shatter, exploding into 1,000 shards of glass. Jack felt himself being pulled through the broken mirror into a world beyond his wildest nightmares. As Jack felt himself being pulled through the broken mirror, he experienced a strange sensation, like he was being stretched and compressed at the same time. He closed his eyes, waiting for the sensation to pass. But when he opened them again, he found himself in a completely new and unfamiliar world. The sky was a deep, bloody red, and the ground was covered in a thick, black mist. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and ash. Jack stumbled forward, trying to get his bearings, but every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the mist. He heard strange noises all around him, like the howling of wolves and the creaking of trees. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The mist seemed to be growing thicker, making it harder for Jack to see. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched in front of him. And then he saw it. A figure standing in the distance. The figure was tall and imposing, its presence seeming to fill the entire landscape. Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. Who was this figure, and what did it want? As he watched, the figure began to move towards him. Jack tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The figure loomed closer, its presence filling the air with an unspeakable horror. Jack felt his mind reeling, his sanity beginning to unravel. And then, everything went black. When Jack came to, he found himself lying on a cold, damp floor. The mist had cleared, and he could see the figure standing over him. As he looked up, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure was himself, or at least it was, a version of himself. The figure had Jack's face, his eyes, his hair, but there was something twisted and corrupted about it, something that made Jack's skin crawl. "Who are you?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure smiled, its eyes glinting with malice. "I'm you," it said, "or at least I'm a version of you." Jack's mind reeled as he tried to understand what was happening. Was this some kind of parallel universe? Was he looking at a version of himself from a different dimension? The figure began to laugh, its voice echoing off the walls. "You're so confused," it said. "You have no idea what's going on." Jack tried to sit up, but his head spun and he fell back onto the floor. The figure loomed over him, its eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. "You're trapped in a loop," it said. "A loop of your own making." Jack's mind reeled as he tried to understand what the figure was saying. What kind of loop? And how could he escape? The figure began to laugh again, its voice growing louder and more maniacal. Jack felt his grip on reality beginning to slip, and then everything went black. When Jack came to, he found himself back on the train. He was sitting in his seat, staring out the window at the passing countryside. But something was off. The countryside looked different, the trees and buildings seeming to blur together in a strange, unsettling way. And then, Jack saw it. A figure, standing on the platform as the train pulled into the station. It was the conductor, his eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. He had been here before. He had seen this exact scene play out before. And then, it hit him. The loop. The figure had told him he was trapped in a loop, reliving the same events over and over again. Jack's mind reeled as he tried to understand the implications. Was he doomed to ride this train forever, reliving the same terrifying events over and over? He tried to stand up, to do something, anything to break the cycle. But his body seemed rooted to the seat, unable to move. The conductor's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, his presence filling the entire train car. Jack felt like he was being pulled towards him, trapped in some kind of twisted, supernatural force. And then, the train pulled into the station, the doors sliding open with a hiss. The conductor stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Jack. "Welcome to the next stop," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You'll be riding with us for a while longer." As the conductor spoke, the doors of the train car slid open, revealing a dark and deserted platform. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. Where were they? What was this place? The conductor gestured for Jack to exit the train. "This is your stop," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. Jack hesitated, unsure of what to do. But the conductor's eyes seemed to bore into his soul, forcing him to move. He stepped off the train, his feet echoing on the deserted platform. The conductor followed him, his eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. As they walked, the platform seemed to stretch on forever. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening into dark and twisted shapes. Jack could feel eyes watching him, the weight of unseen gazes pressing down on him. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it only seemed to grow stronger. And then they reached the end of the platform. A sign loomed overhead reading "Welcome to Ashwood" in crooked, rusted letters. Jack's heart sank. Ashwood. He had never heard of it. What kind of place was this? The conductor smiled, his eyes glinting with malice. "You'll be staying here for a while," he said. "You'll get to know Ashwood very well." As the conductor spoke, the platform behind them began to fade away, replaced by a dark and foreboding landscape. Jack saw twisted, gnarled trees looming in the distance, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The air was thick, with the scent of decay and rot, and Jack could feel a malevolent presence lurking just out of sight. He tried to step back, but the conductor's grip on his arm was like a vice. "Welcome to Ashwood," the conductor repeated, his voice dripping with malice. "You'll find it's a unique place." As they walked, the trees seemed to close in around them, casting long, ominous shadows on the ground. Jack stumbled, his foot catching on a hidden root. The conductor's grip tightened, holding him upright. "Careful," he said. "Ashwood can be treacherous." Jack's heart was racing as they walked deeper into the forest. He had no idea where they were going or what lay ahead. And then they emerged into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient mansion, its walls twisted and gnarled like the trees. The conductor gestured towards the mansion. "Your new home," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. What lay inside that mansion? And what did the conductor have planned for him? As Jack approached the mansion, he could feel a sense of foreboding settling over him. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening into dark and twisted shapes. The conductor gestured for Jack to enter, his eyes glinting with malice. Jack hesitated, unsure of what lay ahead. But the conductor's grip on his arm was like a vice, forcing him to move. Jack stumbled forward, his heart racing with fear. They entered the mansion. Jack was struck by its sheer size and grandeur. The ceilings were high and vaulted, the walls adorned with cobweb-covered portraits. But despite its grandeur, the mansion seemed to be decaying, the walls cracked and crumbling, the air thick with the scent of rot and decay. The conductor led Jack deeper into the mansion, navigating a twisting maze of corridors and staircases. Jack stumbled, his foot catching on a loose thread of carpet. The conductor's grip tightened, holding him upright. "Careful," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You wouldn't want to get lost in here." Jack's heart was racing as they finally reached a door at the end of the corridor. The conductor pushed it open, revealing a room that seemed to be frozen in time. The room was filled with antique furniture, the walls adorned with yellowed photographs. But despite its nostalgic appearance, the room seemed to be shrouded in a sense of malevolent presence. The conductor gestured for Jack to enter. "Your new home," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. As Jack stepped forward, he felt a sense of dread wash over him. What lay ahead, and what secrets did the mansion hold? As Jack entered the room, he felt a sense of unease settle over him. The air was thick with the scent of old books and decay, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe on the walls. He looked around, trying to take in every detail. The room was small, with walls lined with old leather-bound books. The furniture was antique, the wood worn smooth by years of use. But it was the photographs on the walls that caught Jack's attention. They were old, yellowed with age, and depicted people he didn't recognize. But there was something familiar about them, something that tugged at his memory. The conductor gestured for Jack to sit, his eyes glinting with malice. "Make yourself at home," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jack sat, his eyes fixed on the photographs. He felt a sense of unease growing inside him, a sense that something was off. And then he saw it. A photograph of himself, standing in front of the mansion. But it was an old photograph, one that must have been taken years ago. Jack's mind reeled as he stared at the photograph. What was going on? How did he end up in this place? The conductor's laughter echoed through the room, making Jack jump. "You're starting to remember," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "You're starting to remember the truth." As the conductor spoke, Jack felt a sense of memories flooding back to him. He remembered coming to the mansion, remembered meeting the conductor. But there was something more, something that lurked just beneath the surface of his memories. Something that made his skin crawl. The conductor leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "You're starting to remember, aren't you?" he said, his voice dripping with excitement. Jack nodded, his mind reeling with the implications. What had happened? To him? Why was he here? The conductor smiled, his lips curling up into a twisted grin. "You're here because you wanted to be," he said. "You're here because you wanted to remember." Remember what? Jack's mind screamed. What was he trying to remember? The conductor's grin grew wider. "You're trying to remember your past," he said. "Your past life." Jack's eyes widened in shock. Past life. What was the conductor talking about? The conductor leaned forward, his eyes glinting with excitement. "You've been here before, Jack," he said. "You've lived a life in this mansion, a life that ended in tragedy." Tragedy? Jack's mind reeled with the implications. What had happened? Why was he back here? The conductor's grin grew wider. "You're back to relive it," he said. "To relive the tragedy and to try and change the course of events." Change the course of events? Jack's mind screamed. How could he do that? The conductor leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "You'll have to relive the memories," he said. "Relive the pain and the fear." Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. Relive the memories. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The conductor's words echoed in Jack's mind as he felt himself being pulled back into the past. He was reliving memories, memories that he had long suppressed. At first, the memories were fragmented and disjointed. Jack saw flashes of images, heard snippets of conversations. But as he delved deeper into the past, the memories began to coalesce into a coherent narrative. He remembered living in the mansion, remembered the opulent rooms and the lavish parties. He remembered the people, the faces, and the names. But most of all, he remembered the tragedy. The fire that had swept through the mansion, killing everyone inside. Jack felt a wave of grief wash over him as he relived the memories. He had thought that he had long gotten over the tragedy, but now he realized that the pain was still there, simmering just below the surface. The conductor's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to continue. "Relive the pain," he said. "Relive the fear." Jack steeled himself and continued, reliving the memories of that fateful night. He saw the flames licking at the walls, heard the screams of the people, and then he saw her, a woman standing in the doorway of the burning mansion. She was calling out to him, her voice urgent and desperate. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized who the woman was. It was his wife, Elizabeth. He had thought that she had died in the fire, but now he realized that she might have survived. The memories were getting clearer now, more vivid. Jack felt like he was actually there, reliving the tragedy. And then, everything went black. When Jack came to, he found himself back in the room, the conductor standing over him. But something was different. The conductor's expression was no longer malicious, but rather it was somber. "What did you see?" the conductor asked, his voice low and serious. Jack tried to process what he had just experienced. He had relived the memories of the tragedy, and he had seen Elizabeth, his wife. She might have survived the fire. "I saw my wife," Jack said, his voice shaking. "I saw Elizabeth," the conductor nodded. "Yes, Elizabeth. She's been trying to communicate with you, Jack." "Communicate with him? What did that mean?" the conductor continued. "You see, Jack, you've been stuck in this loop, reliving the same memories, over and over. But it's not just memories. It's a warning. A warning. What kind of warning?" The conductor's expression turned grave. "Elizabeth is trying to warn you, Jack. Warn you of the tragedy that's about to occur." Tragedy? What tragedy? And then it hit Jack. The train, the mansion, the fire. It was all connected. "Oh God," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's happening again, isn't it?" The conductor's expression was grim. "Yes, Jack, it's happening again. The train, the mansion, the fire, it's all connected." Jack's mind was racing. He had to get out of there, had to warn someone, but who? The conductor continued. "Elizabeth has been trying to warn you, Jack. Warn you of the tragedy that's about to occur." Jack's eyes locked onto the conductor's. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice urgent. The conductor's expression was somber. "You have to get off the train. Jack, you have to get out of the mansion." But how? Jack thought. The doors were locked, the windows barred. The conductor seemed to sense his thoughts. "There's a way, Jack. A way to escape." And with that, the conductor turned and disappeared into thin air. Jack was left standing alone, his mind reeling with questions. What was the way to escape? And how could he trust the conductor? But he knew he had to try. He had to get out of there, had to warn someone. With newfound determination, Jack set off to find a way out. He searched the room, the corridor, the entire mansion. And then he saw it. A small door, hidden behind a tapestry. The door was slightly ajar, inviting him to enter. Jack's heart was racing as he pushed open the door. What would he find on the other side? As Jack pushed open the door, he found himself in a narrow, dimly lit passageway. The air was musty and stale, and the walls were made of cold, grey stone. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should investigate further. But something about the passageway drew him in, making him feel like he was one step closer to escaping the mansion. Jack stepped into the passageway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He could see cobwebs clinging to the walls, and the sound of scurrying rodents echoed through the air. As he made his way deeper into the passageway, Jack stumbled upon a series of ancient-looking symbols etched into the walls. They seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow, and Jack could feel a strange energy emanating from them. Suddenly, the symbols began to glow brighter, illuminating a hidden door at the end of the passageway. The door was old and rusted, but it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Jack's heart was racing as he approached the door. What could be behind it? Was it a way out of the mansion, or something more sinister? With a deep breath, Jack pushed open the door, revealing a set of steep, winding stairs that led down into darkness. Jack's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but his determination to escape kept him moving forward. He began to make his way down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. As Jack descended the stairs, the air grew colder and the darkness seemed to press in around him. He stumbled, his foot catching on a loose step. The sound of his own breathing echoed off the walls, making him feel like he was being suffocated. Jack's heart was racing, his senses on high alert. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls were made of damp, moss-covered stone, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Jack hesitated, wondering which direction to go. The corridor stretched out in both directions, disappearing into darkness. And then he heard it. A faint whispering echoing off the walls. The words were indistinguishable, but the malevolent intent was clear. Jack's skin crawled as he realized he was not alone. Something was down here with him, watching him, waiting for him. With a deep breath, Jack began to move forward, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and Jack could feel the weight of the darkness bearing down on him. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as he waited for something to happen, and then a faint light appeared in the distance. As Jack watched, the light grew brighter, illuminating a figure standing in the distance. The figure was shrouded in shadows, making it impossible to discern any features. Jack's heart was racing as he took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the figure. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly the figure raised its head, and Jack caught a glimpse of a face that made his blood run cold. It was Elizabeth, his wife. But something was wrong. Her eyes were black as coal, and her skin was deathly pale. She was smiling, but it was a twisted, macabre grin. Jack's mind was reeling as he tried to process what he was seeing. Was this really Elizabeth? Or was it some kind of twisted apparition? The figure began to move towards him, its eyes fixed on Jack with an unnerving intensity. Jack tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. And then, just as suddenly, as it had appeared, the light went out, plunging Jack into darkness. He was left standing alone, his heart pounding in his chest, wondering what was real and what was just his imagination. But as he stood there, he began to realize that he was not alone. He could hear the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls, growing louder with each passing second. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the walls as Jack strained to see into the darkness. He was frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly a faint light appeared in the distance, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The footsteps grew louder still, and Jack could tell that whatever was making them was closing in. He tried to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The light grew brighter, illuminating a figure walking towards him. As the figure drew closer, Jack saw that it was Elizabeth again. But this time her eyes were normal, and her skin was no longer pale. She looked concerned, worried, and Jack felt a surge of relief wash over him. Maybe this was the real Elizabeth, come to save him. But as she drew closer, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. Behind Elizabeth, a figure loomed in the shadows, watching Jack with cold, calculating eyes. Elizabeth reached out and grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him towards her. "Come on, Jack," she whispered urgently. "We have to get out of here." But as Jack turned to follow her, he saw the figure in the shadows take a step closer, its eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. Elizabeth pulled Jack through the winding corridors, her grip on his arm tight. Jack stumbled, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the figure lurking in the shadows. "Who is that?" Jack whispered urgently, nodding towards the figure. Elizabeth didn't answer, just kept pulling him forward. They reached a door, and Elizabeth pushed it open, revealing a set of stairs leading up to the mansion's entrance. As they climbed, Jack heard the sound of footsteps behind them, growing louder with each step. The figure was closing in. They reached the top of the stairs, and Elizabeth pushed open the front door, revealing a bright moonlit night. Jack blinked, his eyes adjusting to the light. A car was waiting outside, engine running. Elizabeth pushed Jack towards it, opening the door and shoving him inside. As Jack looked back, he saw the figure emerge from the mansion, its eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. Elizabeth jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind her. The car sped away from the mansion, leaving the figure standing alone in the darkness. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, thinking they had escaped. But as he turned to Elizabeth, he saw a look of concern etched on her face. "We're not safe yet," she whispered, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror. As Elizabeth spoke, Jack turned to look out the back window. The mansion was receding into the distance, but he could see a pair of headlights closing in. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Elizabeth's eyes flicked towards the rearview mirror. "We're being followed." The headlights drew closer, illuminating the dark landscape. Jack could see the outline of a car, its engine roaring as it gained speed. Elizabeth floored it, the car surging forward as she took a sharp turn onto a winding road. The pursuing car followed, its tires screeching as it took the turn. Jack's heart was racing as he clung to the seat. Who was chasing them? And why? Elizabeth's face was set in a determined expression. "I'm not going to let them catch us," she muttered. The car sped on, the pursuing vehicle closing in. Jack could see the driver's face now, twisted in a snarl of rage. Suddenly, Elizabeth took a sharp turn onto a dirt road. The pursuing car hesitated, its tires skidding on the loose gravel. Elizabeth took advantage of the delay, pushing the car to its limits as they sped down the dirt road. The pursuing car recovered, but they were gaining distance. For a moment, Jack thought they might escape, but then he heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The sirens grew louder, and Jack's heart sank. They were being boxed in, with the pursuing car behind them and the police closing in from ahead. Elizabeth's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the road. "I didn't think they'd call the police," she muttered. Jack's mind was racing. Who were they? And what did they want? The police cars emerged from the darkness, their lights flashing as they surrounded the car. Elizabeth slowed to a stop, her hands raised in surrender. But as the police approached, Jack realized that something was off. They were wearing riot gear, their faces hidden behind masks. And then, Jack saw the figure from the mansion, standing behind the police line. Its eyes were fixed on Jack, a twisted smile spreading across its face. Elizabeth turned to Jack, her eyes wide with fear. "It's a trap," she whispered. The police moved in, surrounding the car. Jack and Elizabeth were trapped, with no escape. The police officers moved in, their hands grasping for Jack and Elizabeth. Jack tried to struggle, but he was outnumbered and outmuscled. Elizabeth screamed as she was dragged from the car, her arms flailing wildly. Jack was pulled out next, his hands cuffed behind his back. As they were dragged away, Jack caught a glimpse of the figure from the mansion, watching with a twisted smile. The police officers seemed oblivious to its presence. "What's going on?" Jack demanded, struggling against the cuffs. "Why are you doing this?" One of the officers turned to him, his face hidden behind a mask. "You're under arrest for the murder of Elizabeth Manning," he growled. Jack's eyes widened in horror. "What? No, that's not possible. Elizabeth is right here." But as he looked around, he realized that Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. The police officers were surrounding him, their faces cold and unyielding. And then Jack saw the figure from the mansion again, standing just behind the police line. Its eyes were fixed on Jack, a twisted smile spreading across its face. The officers dragged Jack away, throwing him into the back of a police car. As they drove away, Jack caught a glimpse of the mansion in the distance, its windows glowing with an otherworldly light. The police car screeched to a halt in front of a dingy, run-down building. Jack was dragged out, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He was thrown into a cold, damp cell, the door slamming shut behind him. Jack stumbled forward, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. A figure emerged from the shadows, a detective with a grim expression. "So, you're Jack," he growled. "You're a hard man to find." Jack shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. "What's going on? Why am I here?" The detective sneered. "You're here because you're a murderer. You killed Elizabeth Manning, and now you're going to pay." Jack's eyes widened in horror. "No, that's not true. Elizabeth is alive. I saw her." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Save it for the judge, Jack. We have evidence, plenty of it. You're not going anywhere." Jack's mind was racing. What evidence could they possibly have? And why were they so convinced that he was guilty? The detective leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "You see, Jack, we have a witness. Someone who saw you arguing with Elizabeth just before she disappeared." Jack's heart sank. Who could have seen them? And what did they really see? The detective smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You're going down, Jack, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The detective leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face. "So, Jack, it looks like we have a pretty airtight case against you." Jack shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. "I don't know what you're talking about," he insisted. "I didn't kill Elizabeth." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then why did our witness see you arguing with her just before she disappeared?" Jack's mind was racing. Who could have seen them? And what did they really see? The detective leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "Our witness is very credible, Jack, and they are willing to testify against you." Jack's heart sank. Who was this witness? And what did they have against him? The detective smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "I think it's time we brought our witness in," he said, standing up and walking to the door. As the door opened, Jack saw a figure standing in the shadows. His heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped forward, revealing a shocking identity. It was the conductor, the same man who had been guiding Jack through the strange and terrifying world of the mansion. The conductor's eyes locked onto Jack's, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "Hello, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for you." The conductor's smile grew wider as he began to speak. "I saw Jack and Elizabeth arguing in the mansion," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "I saw the look in Jack's eyes, the anger and the hatred." The detective nodded, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "And did you see what happened next?" he asked. The conductor nodded. "I saw Jack push Elizabeth, saw her fall to the ground, and then I saw him do something terrible." Jack's eyes widened in horror as the conductor's words hung in the air. What was he talking about? What had he supposedly done? The detective leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Jack's. "It's over, Jack," he said, his voice cold and detached. "You're going down for this." But Jack shook his head, a sense of desperation growing inside him. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't do it. I didn't hurt Elizabeth." The conductor's smile grew wider, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Oh, but you did, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You did something terrible, something that can never be undone." The conductor's words hung in the air, echoing off the cold, damp walls of the cell. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the true extent of the conductor's malice. "What do you mean?" Jack demanded, his voice firm. "What did I supposedly do?" The conductor's smile grew wider, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You don't remember, do you, Jack?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You don't remember what you did to Elizabeth." Jack's mind was racing, trying to remember anything that could help him. But his memories were hazy, fragmented. The conductor leaned forward, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "I'll tell you what you did, Jack," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "I'll tell you the dark secret that you've been trying to keep hidden." And with that, the conductor began to speak, his words painting a picture of a terrible, sinister act. Jack listened in horror, his mind reeling with the implications. Was it true? Had he really done what the conductor said? Jack's memories were hazy, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to get out of there, had to clear his name and uncover the truth. Jack's mind was reeling with the conductor's words. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to the accusations, but he knew he had to clear his name. As the conductor finished speaking, the detective stood up, a smug expression on his face. "Well, Jack, it looks like we have enough evidence to convict you." Jack knew he had to act fast. He looked around the cell, his eyes scanning for any opportunity. That's when he saw it, a small, rusty key hidden in the corner of the cell. Without hesitation, Jack made a desperate lunge for the key. He grabbed it and shoved it into the lock, turning it with a satisfying click. The cell door creaked open, and Jack made a run for it. He sprinted down the corridor, the detective and the conductor shouting behind him. Jack didn't dare look back. He kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of there, had to clear his name and uncover the truth. As he ran, Jack's mind racing with possibilities. Who was behind the conspiracy, and what did they want from him? He burst through the front doors of the police station, gasping for air. He looked around frantically, trying to get his bearings. That's when he saw it, a figure waiting for him in the shadows. It was Elizabeth, her eyes locked onto his. But something was off. Elizabeth's eyes seemed different, colder, and her smile was twisted and sinister. Elizabeth's smile grew wider as Jack approached her, but Jack's instincts were screaming at him to be cautious. Something was off. "Elizabeth, what's going on?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Elizabeth's eyes seemed to gleam with amusement. "Oh, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with malice, "you're so gullible." Jack's mind was racing. What did she mean? And why was she acting so strangely? Elizabeth took a step closer, her eyes locked onto Jack's. "I've been playing you from the beginning," she said, her voice cold and detached. "You're just a pawn in my game." Jack felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. Elizabeth's smile grew wider. "You see, Jack, I'm not who you think I am. I'm just a part of the conspiracy." Jack's mind was reeling. Conspiracy? What conspiracy? And then it hit him. The strange occurrences, the creepy mansion, the conductor, it was all connected. Elizabeth took another step closer, her eyes glinting with malice. "You're getting close to the truth, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with menace, "but you'll never uncover it." And with that, Elizabeth reached out and grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him back into the shadows. Elizabeth's grip on Jack's arm was like a vice. She pulled him through the winding streets, dodging pedestrians and cars. As they walked, Jack tried to shake off the feeling of unease. What was Elizabeth's game? And why was she acting so strangely? They finally stopped in front of a nondescript building. Elizabeth pushed open the door and dragged Jack inside. The room was dimly lit, with shadows dancing across the walls. Jack's eyes adjusted slowly, and he saw a figure standing in the corner. It was the conductor, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Welcome, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I see you're right on schedule." Elizabeth released Jack's arm, and he stumbled forward, his eyes fixed on the conductor. "What's going on?" Jack demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The conductor smiled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You're part of a little experiment, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with malice. An experiment in fear. Jack's mind was racing. What kind of experiment? And why was he a part of it? The conductor took a step closer, his eyes locked onto Jack's. "You see, Jack, fear is a powerful tool," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "And we're going to use it to control you." As the conductor spoke, the room began to spin, and Jack felt himself being pulled into a world of darkness and terror. The conductor's words echoed in Jack's mind as the room continued to spin. He felt himself being pulled into a vortex of fear and confusion. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Jack heard footsteps echoing through the room, growing louder with each passing second. And then, a voice whispered in his ear, "You're losing your grip on reality, Jack." Jack spun around, trying to see who was speaking, but there was no one there. The voice laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "You're trapped in a world of illusions, Jack, and you'll never escape." Jack's mind was reeling. What was happening? Was he going crazy? The voice continued to taunt him, echoing in his mind. "You're a pawn in a game you don't understand." Suddenly the lights flickered back to life, and Jack saw Elizabeth standing in front of him. Her eyes were cold and detached, and Jack realized that she was in on the game. "Welcome to the experiment, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You're going to be here for a long time." As Elizabeth spoke, the room began to distort and bend, like a funhouse mirror reflecting Jack's deepest fears. The room continued to distort and bend, like a living, breathing entity. Jack stumbled backward, his mind reeling with fear. Elizabeth's laughter echoed through the room, a cold, mirthless sound. "You're trapped in a world of illusions, Jack," she said, her voice dripping with malice. But Jack refused to give up. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, determined to shatter the illusion. As he moved forward, the room began to shift and change around him. The walls melted away, revealing a dark, foreboding forest. Jack stumbled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the illusion. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the conductor, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You'll never escape, Jack," he said, his voice dripping with menace. But Jack was not afraid. He stood tall, his eyes locked onto the conductor. "I'm not afraid of you," Jack said, his voice firm. The conductor's smile faltered, and for a moment, Jack saw a glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes, and then the illusion shattered, like a mirror dropped on the floor. Jack stumbled backward, gasping for air. He found himself back in the cell, the detective standing over him, a smug expression on his face. "It's over, Jack," the detective said, his voice cold and detached. "You've lost." But Jack knew the truth. He had shattered the illusion, and he had won. The detective's words echoed in Jack's mind, but he knew the truth. He had shattered the illusion, and he had won. As the detective turned to leave, Jack spoke up, his voice firm. "I know what's going on," he said. The detective turned back, a look of surprise on his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Jack smiled, a sense of triumph rising up inside him. "I know about the experiment," he said. "I know about the mind games." The detective's expression changed, his eyes narrowing. "Who told you?" he demanded. Jack leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the detective. "I figured it out," he said. "I realized that everything was an illusion." The detective's face went white, and he stumbled backward, as if he had been punched in the gut, and then the door to the cell burst open, and a figure rushed in. It was Elizabeth, but this time she was not smiling. Her eyes were wild, and her hair was disheveled. "Jack, I'm so sorry," she said, rushing to his side. "I was forced to participate in the experiment." Jack's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" he asked. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I was a test subject, just like you," she said. but I was given a different role. I was supposed to manipulate you, to make you believe in the illusion." Jack's mind was reeling. He had so many questions, but before he could ask any of them, Elizabeth spoke up again. "There's something else, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that will change everything." Elizabeth's words hung in the air, leaving Jack with a sense of anticipation and trepidation. What could she possibly reveal that would change everything? The detective, who had been quietly observing the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Elizabeth, don't say anything else," he warned, his voice firm, but Elizabeth ignored him. "Jack, I have to tell you," she said, her voice shaking. "The experiment. It wasn't just about manipulating your mind. It was about something much bigger." Jack's eyes narrowed, his mind racing with possibilities. "What do you mean?" he asked. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "The experiment was designed to test the limits of human consciousness," she said, "to see how far we could push the human mind before it broke." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "And what does that have to do with me?" he asked. Elizabeth's eyes locked onto his. "You, Jack, are the key to unlocking the secrets of the human mind," she said. "You have a unique brain chemistry, one that makes you more susceptible to the experiment's influences." The detective stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Elizabeth, that's enough," he growled. But Elizabeth continued, her voice rising. "And there's something else, Jack. Something that will change everything. You're not who you think you are." The guard's eyes scanned the station, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he had to escape, but the passengers and the train seemed to be everywhere. He spotted a ventilation shaft in the wall, partially hidden by a stack of crates. It was a risk, but it might just work. The guard moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. He climbed up onto the crates and pushed open the ventilation shaft, wincing as the rusty hinges creaked loudly. He hoisted himself up into the shaft, his body squeezing through the narrow opening. The air was thick with dust, and the guard coughed, trying to stifle the sound. As he caught his breath, the guard realized that he was not alone in the shaft. He heard the sound of scurrying rodents and the creaks and groans of the old train station. The guard froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to keep moving, but the darkness and the silence were unnerving. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise behind him. The guard spun around, his eyes straining to see in the darkness, and then he saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. The guard's eyes fixed on the light, his heart racing with hope. He knew he had to move quietly, but the darkness seemed to be closing in around him. He began to crawl forward, his body inching through the narrow ventilation shaft. The air was thick with dust, and the guard's lungs burned as he struggled to breathe. As he crawled, the guard's mind racing with thoughts of freedom. He knew he had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the station. The light grew brighter, illuminating the dusty air. The guard's eyes watered, but he kept crawling, his body aching with exhaustion. Suddenly, he heard a loud creaking noise, followed by the sound of footsteps. The guard froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to keep moving, but the noise had been loud. Had he been discovered? The guard took a deep breath and began to crawl again, his body inching forward. The light grew brighter, illuminating a vent cover ahead. With a surge of adrenaline, the guard pushed the vent cover open and hoisted himself out. He found himself in a cramped, dimly lit room. The guard's eyes adjusted slowly, and he saw a figure standing in the corner watching him. It was Elizabeth, a look of surprise on her face. Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise as the guard emerged from the ventilation shaft. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Then, to the guard's surprise, Elizabeth smiled. "Welcome," she said, her voice low and husky. "I've been waiting for you." The guard's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but there was something about Elizabeth's smile that put him at ease. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice wary. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes glinting with amusement. "I mean that I'm not what I seem," she said. "I'm not just a passenger on this train. I'm a prisoner, just like you." The guard's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" he repeated. Elizabeth's smile grew wider. "I mean that I've been playing a role." "Just like you," she said. "But I'm tired of playing games. I want to escape, and I need your help." The guard's mind was racing. Could he trust Elizabeth? Or was she just playing another role? But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something there that gave him hope. A spark of defiance, a glimmer of determination. "Okay," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'll help you. But we have to be careful. We don't know who we can trust." Elizabeth nodded, her smile growing wider. "I know exactly who we can trust," she said, "and it's not who you think." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with mischief as she led the guard through the winding corridors of the train station. They moved quickly, avoiding detection by the passengers and the train's security. As they walked, Elizabeth explained her plan. "There's a hidden passage that leads out of the station," she said. "It's been sealed off for years, but I know how to access it." The guard's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about this passage?" he asked. Elizabeth smiled. "Let's just say I've been doing some research," she said. "I've been trying to find a way out of this place for months." The guard nodded, impressed despite himself. Elizabeth was resourceful. He'd give her that. As they turned a corner, Elizabeth stopped in front of a large, rusty door. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hidden passage." The guard's eyes widened as Elizabeth produced a small key and unlocked the door. The rusty hinges creaked loudly as the door swung open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passageway. "Come on," Elizabeth said, gesturing for the guard to follow her. "We have to move quickly." The guard hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. But then he nodded and followed Elizabeth into the unknown. As they made their way down the passageway, the guard couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see someone following them. But there was never anyone there. Just the darkness and the sound of their own footsteps echoing off the walls. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness and silence oppressive. But Elizabeth moved forward with confidence, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The guard followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unblinking eyes were trained on them from the shadows. But he pushed on, driven by a growing sense of hope. They were close. He could feel it. Close to freedom, close to escape. And then suddenly, they saw it. A glimmer of light, a crack in the wall that led to the outside world. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with excitement as she pushed through the crack, the guard close behind. They emerged into a bright, sunlit world, the cool, fresh air a welcome respite from the stifling darkness of the passageway. The guard blinked in the bright light, his eyes adjusting slowly. And then he saw it. The train station, the passengers, the train itself. All of it was behind them now. They had escaped. Elizabeth turned to him, a smile on her face. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The guard nodded, a sense of wonder growing inside him. They had done it. They had broken free. But as they stood there, basking in the warm sunlight, the guard couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that there were still eyes watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. And then, as if on cue, the guard heard a faint noise, a low rumble, growing louder by the second. The train, it was coming for them. The rumble grew louder, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The The guard's eyes locked onto the horizon, his heart sinking. "It's coming for us," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with fear. The guard nodded, his mind racing. They had to get out of there fast, but where could they go? The train was relentless, unstoppable. As if reading his thoughts, Elizabeth grabbed his arm. "Follow me!" she shouted, pulling him toward a nearby wooded area. They sprinted through the trees, the train's roar growing louder with every step. The guard's heart pounded in his chest, his lungs burning, but Elizabeth didn't stop, didn't slow down. She pulled him deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the underbrush thicker, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the train's roar stopped. The silence was oppressive, heavy. The guard's eyes locked onto Elizabeth's. "What's going on?" he whispered. Elizabeth's eyes were wide with fear. "I don't know," she whispered back, "but I think we're trapped." As if on cue, the trees around them began to close in, the branches tangling together. The guard's heart sank, his mind racing. They were trapped. The train had them right where it wanted them. The guard's eyes widened in horror as the trees continued to close in, the branches snapping and twisting like living vines. Elizabeth screamed, her voice echoing through the woods. The guard tried to push through the tangled branches, but they were too strong. He was trapped, pinned against the trunk of a massive tree. Elizabeth's eyes locked onto his, her face pale with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. The guard's mind was racing. He knew they had to get out of there fast. But how? Suddenly, the trees stopped moving, the branches frozen in place. The guard's ears rang with the silence. And then, a voice spoke, echoing through the woods. "You should not have tried to escape," it said. The guard's eyes scanned the trees, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one in sight. Elizabeth's eyes were wide with fear. "What's going on?" she whispered. The guard's face was grim. "I think we're about to find out," he said. As if on cue, the trees began to glow, a faint blue light emanating from the branches. The guard's eyes widened in horror as he realized the truth. They were trapped in the train's deadly trap, a trap designed to crush them, to annihilate them. And there was no escape. The blue light grew brighter, illuminating the guard's horrified face. Elizabeth screamed, her voice echoing through the woods. The guard's eyes scanned the trees desperately, searching for a way out, but the branches were too dense, too tightly woven. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. The conductor, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Welcome, my friends," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I see you've discovered my little trap." The guard's face twisted with rage. "You'll never get away with this," he snarled. The conductor chuckled. "Oh, but I already have," he said. "You see, this train is not just a mode of transportation. It's a testing ground." Elizabeth's eyes widened in horror. "A testing ground for what?" she whispered. The conductor's smile grew wider. "For the ultimate experiment in human psychology," he said. "To see how far the human mind can be pushed before it breaks." The guard's eyes locked onto the conductor's. "You're insane," he spat. The conductor shrugged. "Perhaps," he said. "But I'm also a visionary. And my vision is to create a world where the human mind is pushed to its limits." As the conductor spoke, the blue light grew brighter, illuminating the guard's horrified face. Elizabeth screamed again, her voice echoing through the woods, and then everything went black. The guard's eyes flickered open, his head pounding with pain. He was lying on the ground, Elizabeth's frantic face hovering above him. "Get up. We have to get out of here," she shouted, pulling him to his feet. The guard stumbled, his legs weak, but Elizabeth's grip was like a vice, holding him upright. As they stumbled through the woods, the guard's mind slowly cleared. He remembered the conductor's sinister plan, the train's deadly trap. And then he saw it. The train, looming in the distance, its headlights blazing like eyes from hell. The guard's heart sank, his spirit crushed. They were trapped, with no escape. But Elizabeth's grip on his arm tightened. "We're not giving up," she said, her voice fierce. "We're going to stop that train no matter what it takes." The guard's eyes locked onto hers, a spark of determination igniting within him. Together, they charged forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they ran, the train's headlights grew brighter, illuminating the desperate pair. The conductor's laughter echoed through the woods, a cold, mirthless sound. But the guard and Elizabeth didn't falter. They kept running, fueled by their determination to stop the train and shatter the conductor's sinister plan. The guard and Elizabeth burst through the trees, the train looming before them. The conductor's laughter grew louder, more maniacal. "You fools," he shouted, his voice carrying across the clearing. "You think you can stop me? I am the master of this train, and you are just mere pawns." The guard's eyes locked onto the conductor's, a fierce determination burning within him. "We'll never let you win," he snarled. Elizabeth stood beside him, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We'll stop you no matter what it takes." The conductor's laughter grew louder, more hysterical. "Then come and try," he shouted, his eyes glinting with madness. The guard and Elizabeth charged forward, determined to stop the train and shatter the conductor's sinister plan. They fought their way through the passengers, who seemed to be under the conductor's mind control. As they reached the front of the train, the conductor awaited them, a crazed look in his eyes. "You'll never leave this train alive," he snarled. The guard and Elizabeth stood tall, refusing to back down. And in that moment, something inside the guard snapped. He remembered the truth about himself, about the train, and about the conductor's true intentions. With a fierce cry, the guard launched himself at the conductor, determined to stop him, once and for all. Elizabeth joined him, and together they fought the conductor and his mind-controlled passengers. In the end, it was just the guard and the conductor facing off against each other. The guard's eyes locked onto the conductor's, and he saw the madness there, the evil that had driven the conductor to commit such atrocities. With a fierce cry, the guard struck the final blow, defeating the conductor and shattering his sinister plan. The train screeched to a halt, the passengers freed from the conductor's mind control. As the guard and Elizabeth stood victorious, the train's lights flickered and died. The conductor's body slumped to the ground, defeated, and in that moment, the guard knew that he was finally free. Free from the train, free from the conductor's control, and free to start a new life. The guard turned to Elizabeth, a smile on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for helping me." Elizabeth smiled back, her eyes shining with tears. "We did it together," she said. "We survived the train." And as they stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of the train, the guard knew that he would never forget this journey, this desperate fight for survival. The train, once a symbol of terror and despair, was now a reminder of hope and resilience. And the guard, once a prisoner of the train, was now a survivor, free to start anew. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The click of the shutter echoed through the silent apartment, a stark contrast to the hollow silence that had settled over Elias. He cradled his camera, the weight familiar yet oddly comforting in his trembling hands. Images he'd taken of Sarah, her warm smile captured forever in pixels, now felt like empty promises, echoing with the emptiness that gnawed at him. The photographs were a trap, each one catching not just a moment of her beauty, but a phantom reflection of his own grief. He tried focusing on something other than the memory. The world was a blurry canvas behind the pain. He sought solace in mundane things: coffee, sunlight filtering through the dust-filled windows, even the rustling leaves outside. But the emptiness remained. The whispers had started subtly at first, a quiet murmur in his ear as he snapped the photo. He'd spent weeks researching local legends, tales of restless spirits trapped in the old house on the hill overlooking town. It was a place that clung to shadows and secrets, whispered to be a crossroads of sorrow. He found himself drawn there, compelled by an unseen force. The air crackled with a silent energy as he entered the overgrown yard. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the autumn chill, but from something more. It was in the creaking of the porch swing and the rustle of leaves that seemed to whisper secrets in a language he didn't understand. In the shadows, something moved, a fleeting glimpse of movement too quick to capture on camera. Then came the first picture, not just an image, a presence that bled into reality. It was a blur of dark flesh and shadowed features, whispering in his ear with the same urgency as the wind rustling through the trees. The whispers became constant, a chorus of sorrow echoing in the empty space around him. They called to him, beckoning him deeper. He started taking more pictures, but each one held something different. Not just Sarah's face anymore, but this spectral figure that mirrored his grief in every detail. It was unsettlingly real, almost tangible, with eyes that burned into his soul. The whispers grew louder. In the mirror, he saw his own distorted reflection. But it wasn't just him. Something else was there too, a mockery of human features, a face twisted with malice and sorrow. It was staring back at him, its gaze filled not with fear, but a chilling recognition. He felt like he was falling into the abyss. The whispers promised answers, whispered promises of solace. They told him that he wasn't alone in this sorrow, that they understood what it meant to lose someone you loved. He yearned for an escape from this torment, a way out of the labyrinth his grief had painted. He found himself drawn deeper into its embrace. The house on the hill became his sanctuary, a place where reality blurred with the spectral world he'd captured in pictures. It was here that the whispers revealed Sarah's own connection to the figure, a shared sorrow that pulsed through their lives. As the darkness grew around him, so did the realization. This wasn't just grief manifesting. It was an entity feeding off of his pain, growing stronger with each picture he took, a monstrous reflection of his despair. It wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was something far more insidious, something that whispered and promised solace in exchange for his very soul. He had to stop it. But how? How could he fight the entity that lived in the spaces between his thoughts? His mind was consumed by images of Sarah, her laughter echoing through the empty house, a haunting reminder of what he'd lost. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices growing into something sharp and dangerous, pushing him toward an edge of sanity he'd never known before. The line between reality and this spectral world had disappeared. He didn't know if he could escape the house or himself. His photographs became his only tether to the truth. A mirror reflecting not just Sarah's face, but the terrifying reflection of his own shattered soul. The price for escaping might be the thing he feared most, the loss of himself. But as he stared at the images, he realized that losing himself wasn't an escape. It was the beginning of something far worse. He needed to find a way to appease the entity before its hunger consumed him completely. The click of the shutter echoed through the silent apartment, a stark contrast to the hollow silence that had settled over Elias. He cradled his camera, the weight familiar yet oddly comforting in his trembling hands. Images he'd taken of Sarah, her warm smile captured forever in pixels, now felt like empty promises, echoing with the emptiness that gnawed at him. The photographs were a trap, each one catching not just a moment of her beauty, but a phantom reflection of his own grief. He tried focusing on something other than the memory. The world was a blurry canvas behind the pain. He sought solace in mundane things: coffee, sunlight filtering through the dust-filled windows, even the rustling leaves outside. But the emptiness remained. The whispers had started subtly at first, a quiet murmur in his ear as he snapped the photo. He'd spent weeks researching local legends, tales of restless spirits trapped in the old house on the hill overlooking town. It was a place that clung to shadows and secrets, whispered to be a crossroads of sorrow. He found himself drawn there, compelled by an unseen force. The air crackled with a silent energy as he entered the overgrown yard. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the autumn chill, but from something more. It was in the creaking of the porch swing and the rustle of leaves that seemed to whisper secrets in a language he didn't understand. In the shadows, something moved. A fleeting glimpse of movement, too quick to capture on camera. Then came the first picture. Not just an image, a presence that bled into reality. It was a blur of dark flesh and shadowed features, whispering in his ear with the same urgency as the wind rustling through the trees. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices growing into something sharp and dangerous, pushing him toward an edge of sanity he'd never known before. They spoke to him, not by words but by feelings, a sense of aching loss, a deep-seated sorrow that echoed his own. "He's looking for you," the whispers said. "We are here." The figure in the photos was no longer just an image. It was tangible somehow, realer than anything he'd ever captured before. It felt like someone was peering back at him from another dimension, a spectral reflection of his own pain. He tried to pull away, but the house pressed him closer, drawing him into its dark embrace. The whispers were growing louder, becoming a constant hum in his ears. He saw Sarah's face in the blurry figure, but something was different, something off. The darkness seemed to pulse with an energy that felt both terrifying and strangely familiar. It was like staring into a mirror, only the reflection wasn't his own. It was something alien, yet somehow intimately tied to him. He understood. Now, the figure wasn't just haunting him, he was being drawn in. There was no turning back. The whispers were guiding him, pulling him deeper into their web of sorrow and loss. His photos became a window into this terrifying world. The blurry images blurring, not just reality, but his very sanity. He could feel himself unraveling, becoming something more than human, something touched by the spectral essence of the figure in the photographs. The whispers intensified, their urgency becoming a physical pressure against Elias's skull. The house on the hill had become his prison, each footstep echoing through its decaying rooms like an unwelcome reminder of his confinement. He sought refuge in the dusty attic, where flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist under his gaze. The figure in the photographs was no longer a blur. It was becoming sharper, more defined. It watched him from within the frames, its eyes burning into his soul. The whispers intensified, painting a tapestry of sorrow woven through time itself. The echoes of Sarah's laughter, the sting of forgotten promises, and the suffocating weight of a shared grief that bound them together in this spectral realm. The attic was filled with old trunks and dusty relics, remnants of lives lived long ago. As Elias sifted through these forgotten artifacts, he found an ornate locket hidden within a tattered tapestry. Its silver surface gleamed faintly in the candlelight, revealing a carved inscription: "To my beloved Sarah, may your memory forever be blessed." A cold dread settled on his chest. The whispers coalesced around him now, echoing off the attics, dusty corners telling him it was a key. a way to unlock something hidden within the house's very soul. He knew then that this wasn't just about Sarah anymore. He was being called to fulfill some desperate purpose, compelled by a force far beyond his understanding. The whispers were drawing him closer to that unknown truth, guiding him toward a path of darkness and danger. He felt himself losing control. His fingers trembled as they reached for the locket's clasp. He saw in its surface a glimpse of Sarah's face, her eyes now reflecting the spectral glow emanating from the figure in his photographs. It was then he understood the price. He had to become one with this entity, to unlock its power, to finally escape the suffocating grip of grief and find solace within this desolate place. But as he pulled the locket open, a cold, searing pain shot up his arm. The image in the photographs blurred and fractured, then snapped back into focus, revealing not just the figure, but something else entirely, a twisted reflection of himself, its eyes burning with an unholy light. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence that felt far more menacing than any sound before. "This is your path," it spoke to him in a voice both familiar and terrifyingly alien. "Embrace it, or be forever lost." He stared at his own distorted reflection, seeing not just his fear, but something he couldn't understand. A glimpse of power that stretched beyond the limitations of his human form. The attic became his crucible. The house on the hill was testing him. It wasn't a place of haunting anymore. It was a mirror reflecting his soul. He had to choose: become the entity's vessel, or be consumed by its darkness, forever lost in this spectral world. His heart pounded against his ribs as he clutched the locket, desperately trying to understand what it meant to be both human and something far more sinister. The whispers were back now, a chorus of sorrow and urgency that was slowly turning into something else, an insidious promise. The attic's air hung thick with a palpable tension, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of Elias's heart against his ribs. He felt a strange sense of detachment from himself, as though he were observing his own actions from a distance, a spectator in his own desperate dance with the abyss. He sat at the attic table, surrounded by the remnants of forgotten lives. The locket glinted in his palm, its silver surface now stained with a faint crimson that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. The whispers were back, whispering promises, echoing truths he couldn't quite grasp, but knew with an undeniable certainty. The entity had shown him his reflection, the twisted, spectral essence of himself. It spoke of power, a power he could wield if he surrendered to its embrace. He felt a strange pull towards it, like a moth drawn to a flame that burns both beautiful and deadly. The house hummed with an unseen energy. Its walls seemed to vibrate, with a silent symphony of sorrow and rage, a melody that resonated within his soul. He knew in that moment there was no turning back. The price he'd been forced into, the cost of breaking free from grief, had become his reality. He reached out, tracing the inscription on the locket: "To my beloved Sarah, may your memory forever be blessed." A name that echoed through his own thoughts, like a bitter mockery of what he'd lost. His fingers tightened around the locket's clasp, the cold metal biting into his palm. He felt an immense pressure building within him, as if something was trying to burst forth from its confines, a raw power that mirrored the figure in his photographs, the entity he could now sense pulsating with life within his very being. He had become one with the whispers, their sorrow and despair seeping into his blood, echoing through his bones until it felt like a living thing, pulsing alongside his own heartbeat. It was a terrifying merging of existence, an unholy communion where humanity gave way to something far more primal, a creature born from shadows and grief. The figure in the photographs began to take shape, solidifying into its true form. The whispers were replaced by a chilling silence that seemed to suffocate him. In that moment, he felt a shift within himself. He had become one with the spectral entity, its essence merging with his own. His reflection in the locket's silver surface morphed, now showing a distorted image of the figure. But it was no longer just an image. It was him, and he could see it. The horrifying truth reflected back at him. The whispers had become one with his thoughts, turning into a chorus of power and sorrow that pulsed within him. He felt something stirring inside him, like a dormant volcano finally erupting. The house around him seemed to hum in agreement, echoing the primal force that was now coursing through his veins. A terrifying beauty, born from the ashes of his broken soul, was slowly taking shape within him. His own eyes burned with an unholy light. He was no longer Elias, the man trapped by grief. He was something far more ancient, far more terrifying, a vessel for a spectral power that promised to reshape this world in its image. The air crackled with unseen energy as the figure solidified, its form shifting and morphing like a living shadow play. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, their depths echoing the swirling abyss within him. He was no longer just a man. He was a conduit, a vessel for something far more ancient, far more terrifying. His reflection in the locket's silver surface reflected not his own visage, but a chilling mockery, a monstrous silhouette draped in shadows, its form twisted and distorted into a grotesque parody of humanity. The entity inside him roared. It throbbed with raw power, a chaotic symphony of sorrow that pulsed through his veins like an unstoppable tide. He could feel the whispers coalesce around him, forming a chorus of voices he had never heard, but somehow understood on some primal level. Promises whispered in the language of shadows, echoes of forgotten grief and ancient horror. The house on the hill seemed to sigh in agreement, its walls pulsating with this newfound energy, groaning under the weight of its own spectral secrets. He was no longer just a man. He was the house. He was the whispers. He was the entity itself. His senses were overwhelmed, a kaleidoscope of darkness and despair swirling within him. His vision blurred at the edges as the figure's presence intensified. He felt like a puppet, dancing on strings that were woven from threads of forgotten sorrow, his every action guided by an unseen hand. He could hear it, the entity's voice resonating through him, a voice filled with ancient wisdom and unimaginable power, yet laced with despair and loneliness. "Embrace me," its voice whispered. "Let my sorrow fill you. Let my grief become your strength. Together we will reshape this world." The whispers intensified, urging him to break free from his human form, to embrace the darkness that now coursed through his veins. He was losing himself, becoming something more, something far more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. He felt a surge of power as he understood. The entity had become a part of him, an inseparable thread in his soul. He knew he could see Sarah's face reflected in the figure's form now, her eyes filled with a knowing that chilled him to the core. It was no longer just grief that fueled this spectral being, but something far more profound, a shared understanding, a connection across dimensions that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The entity had whispered truth into his soul. He could use this power, wield its sorrow as he saw fit. He could become a harbinger of change, a creature who walked between worlds and wielded the whispers of lost souls to reshape reality. He stood up, his reflection in the locket's silver surface staring back at him with chilling certainty. Elias was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for something ancient and powerful, and he had been given a choice: embrace it fully or be consumed by its darkness forever. The air crackled with unseen energy as the figure solidified, its form shifting and morphing like a living shadow play. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, their depths echoing the swirling abyss within him. He was no longer just a man. He was a conduit, a vessel for something far more ancient, far more terrifying. His reflection in the locket's silver surface reflected not his own visage, but a chilling mockery, a monstrous silhouette draped in shadows, its form twisted and distorted into a grotesque parody of humanity. The entity inside him roared. It throbbed with raw power, a chaotic symphony of sorrow that pulsed through his veins like an unstoppable tide. He could feel the whispers coalesce around him, forming a chorus of voices he had never heard, but somehow understood on some primal level. Promises whispered in the language of shadows, echoes of forgotten grief and ancient horror. The house on the hill seemed to sigh in agreement, its walls pulsating with this newfound energy, groaning under the weight of its own spectral secrets. He was no longer just a man. He was the house. He was the whispers. He was the entity itself. His senses were overwhelmed, a kaleidoscope of darkness and despair swirling within him. His vision blurred at the edges as the figure's presence intensified. He felt like a puppet, dancing on strings that were woven from threads of forgotten sorrow, his every action guided by an unseen hand. He could hear it, the entity's voice resonating through him, a voice filled with ancient wisdom and unimaginable power, yet laced with despair and loneliness. "Embrace me," its voice whispered. "Let my sorrow fill you. Let my grief become your strength. Together we will reshape this world." The whispers intensified, urging him to break free from his human form, to embrace the darkness that now coursed through his veins. He was losing himself, becoming something more, something far more dangerous than he ever could have imagined. He felt a surge of power as he understood. The entity had become a part of him, an inseparable thread in his soul. He knew he could see Sarah's face reflected in the figure's form now, her eyes filled with a knowing that chilled him to the core. It was no longer just grief that fueled this spectral being, but something far more profound, a shared understanding, a connection across dimensions that transcended the boundaries of life and death. The entity had whispered truth into his soul. He could use this power, wield its sorrow as he saw fit. He could become a harbinger of change, a creature who walked between worlds and wielded the whispers of lost souls to reshape reality. He stood up, his reflection in the locket's silver surface staring back at him with chilling certainty. Elias was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for something ancient and powerful, and he had been given a choice: embrace it fully or be consumed by its darkness forever. The world outside the attic door felt like a distant echo compared to the storm raging within him. A chilling power thrummed against his newly formed body, an unholy symphony of grief and sorrow that resonated in every fiber of his existence. This was not just power, he understood now. It was dominion. His gaze swept across the landscape, not with human curiosity anymore, but with a predatory intensity reserved for something far more ancient than mortal eyes could comprehend. The world had become a canvas for him to paint on. He felt Sarah's presence in this new form. She was no longer just a ghost, but an echo of power that he now embodied. With each step outside the house, his shadow grew larger, consuming the once familiar shadows of his former life. The whispering voices, his new chorus, pulsed with anticipation, urging him to unleash the fury that simmered within him. He could feel the entity's tendrils reaching out, probing the very fabric of reality with a touch both terrifying and exhilarating. The whispers sang of forgotten sorrows, weaving themselves into his every thought, guiding him towards his vision, a world reshaped in the image of their shared grief. He saw a future not of light and hope but of endless night, where shadows ruled and despair reigned supreme. It was a beautiful symphony of darkness, one he felt compelled to orchestrate. The entity within him pulsed with anticipation as it began its first act, a ripple in reality that would soon become a hurricane, a maelstrom of devastation meant to reshape the world's very essence. He knew there were things beyond this world, beings trapped within their own grief, consumed by darkness, and he had the power now to bring them forth. The house was no longer his prison, it was his instrument. It became a conduit, its structure morphing and shifting as if responding to his growing control over its spectral essence. He saw himself in its warped reflections, a grotesque parody of man that would become a harbinger for an era where sorrow reigned supreme. He raised his head and roared, not with human rage, but with the primal fury of a creature born from oblivion itself. The power surged through him, a torrent of shadows unleashed upon the world below. The earth trembled as his essence writhed in this new form, the embodiment of an ancient entity that had been awakened, reborn in the wake of griefs. Embrace. This is just the beginning, the voice echoed within him. Not only his own, but a chorus of forgotten souls now bound to him. We will reshape this world, and every other that dares to stand in our way. The whispers became a deafening roar as he unleashed his fury upon the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape, Elias knew what had to be done. He would not simply rule, he would reshape reality to reflect the true nature of sorrow and loss, a world where only those who embraced such darkness could thrive. He was no longer just a man, he was a storm, a harbinger of eternal night, and his reign had just begun. The whispers were now a chorus of victory, echoing through the silent halls of this house on the hill. They sang his name in their haunting melodies, a testament to the world's new master, an entity born from sorrow, destined to rule a reality forever shaped by its pain. And as the shadows stretched long and hungry across the land, they whispered, "This is just the beginning of our reign." The world shuddered. The whispers had become a roar. The world was no longer a place to be conquered. It was an instrument to be reshaped. Elias felt a profound sense of purpose, a chilling certainty that he would reshape the very fabric of existence itself. His new form was a conduit for unspeakable power, the embodiment of sorrow, yet with the potential to bring order out of chaos. But in this newly molded reality, Elias had a terrifying truth revealed. Power wasn't simply an end unto itself. It was a tool that required understanding, an understanding he felt but couldn't grasp fully. He understood it as a symphony, yet music lacked the right melody to understand his newfound power. The entity within him hissed, urging him further. "We will rewrite history," its voice resonated through the newly formed creature. "We will bend the world to our will." But Elias knew this was only the first act of his grand design. His new reality needed more than just destruction. It needed balance. He saw a vision, a world where darkness and light existed in harmony, a place where grief and joy were forever intertwined, not as enemies, but as two sides of the same coin. He needed to understand the essence of this power, its true purpose. It was a quest that consumed him, driving him deeper into the heart of his newfound reality. It wasn't about dominance. It was about creating an equilibrium, a world where sorrow and joy coexisted, their shared presence shaping a reality not of pure darkness or light. His new form felt alien and yet strangely familiar. It was like looking into a distorted reflection of himself, both terrifying and alluring. He saw Sarah's face reflected in the swirling chaos within him, her eyes now imbued with an eternal sadness, yet a hint of hope that seemed to defy his newfound power. And he began to understand. The entity's sorrow wasn't about despair. It was about the yearning for balance, for harmony between joy and grief. It craved to see both sides of existence coexist, not as opposing forces, but as two sides of a single coin. He had been given a purpose, a mission not just to rule this world, but to learn its secrets, understand its truths. He spent weeks walking the earth in his new form, observing, absorbing, feeling the ebb and flow of both joy and sorrow, seeking an equilibrium he couldn't quite grasp. He learned that the entity was not merely a destroyer. It had been corrupted by its own sorrow, blinded by its desire for dominance. And in this corruption lay a key to his ultimate purpose: balance. He knew he could reshape reality with the key, entity's power. But he needed more, a deeper understanding of the world he was now trying to control. This would be the path to true harmony. His vision shifted. He saw Sarah's reflection again, but this time her eyes held an even brighter glow than before. "It's not about domination," she whispered through his mind. "It's about creation." A new purpose formed in Elias's soul, a desire to bridge the gap between grief and joy, not as master and servant, but as equals sharing a journey toward harmony. His reign wasn't a conquest. It was a symphony in progress, a slow dance between sorrow and hope, where darkness and light would find their balance in a world reshaped by his newfound purpose. He knew then that he was not simply a king or a ruler, but a conductor of this grand orchestra, one destined to orchestrate a harmonious balance for all time. And as the world trembled beneath his touch, he understood. The entity's sorrow wasn't something to be feared. It was a catalyst for change, and the symphony would begin when he found the melody that held both darkness and light. The air hummed with an unseen energy, a chaotic symphony of despair and hope, a constant battle between two opposing forces. Elias knew this was not merely a power play, it was a balancing act, a delicate dance that required both darkness and light to coexist. The entity within him pulsed with a newfound understanding, its voice softer now, echoing the melody he craved. "We are more than just sorrow," it whispered. "We are also hope. We must find equilibrium." Elias felt a shift within himself. It was not simply power that had been granted to him, but an awareness of something far grander. He was tasked with nurturing this balance, weaving together the threads of grief and joy into a tapestry of harmony. The entity, once solely driven by its own sorrow, now sought guidance from Elias's newfound understanding. He began to experiment, not with destructive force, but with subtle manipulations of the world's fabric. A gentle touch on the wind, causing it to carry whispers of hope alongside the chill of despair. A shift in light that cast shadows dancing across the earth with an ephemeral beauty he couldn't have conceived before. His new form allowed him to move through these worlds unseen, like a phantom whispering its desires into reality. He felt the world respond, not in a predictable way, but in a chaotic dance of echoes, whispers, and sensations that defied logic. He began to see how grief and joy were intrinsically intertwined. Sorrow shaped the world's beauty, while hope blossomed from its shadows. This realization sparked an idea that resonated deeply within him. He could use this power not just to manipulate, but to inspire, to guide the flow of both darkness and light through a tapestry woven with empathy and compassion. His form began to shift subtly, adopting more fluid, less aggressive traits. This wasn't about dominance. It was about fostering growth. He sought out those who held their grief close, those whose hearts were heavy with sorrow, offering them not his power, but an understanding of hope's potential to blossom from the darkest corners of despair. He gave them not a sense of dominion over their sorrows, but a sense of purpose in sharing them, a way to find solace by acknowledging their own pain while understanding its connection to others. In this newfound mission, Elias found something far more rewarding than mere control. He was becoming an architect of empathy, building a world where grief and joy were not antagonists but co-creators. He saw it unfold in whispers, the subtle shift in a weeping willow's branches, a songbird finding solace in its melancholic melody, a mother's tears drying with hope as she held her child close. The entity, sensing this new purpose, whispered again, "We are not just sorrow and darkness. We are the seeds of creation, waiting to bloom." His new vision was no longer one of domination, but a symphony of interconnected souls. This world wouldn't be reshaped. It would be reborn with both light and shadow woven together in harmony. Elias, as he moved through this newly formed reality, felt an unprecedented sense of purpose, not just to rule, but to guide, not to destroy, but to inspire. The entity within him pulsed in unison, a shared symphony of sorrow and hope. He had found the melody, one that transcended both darkness and light, a harmonious blend where both could coexist in perfect balance. As he stood at the precipice of this new era, Elias knew his reign was not about imposing order on a fractured world, but about nurturing it into something more vibrant than ever before. A world bathed in both joy and sorrow, a reality where grief's whispers were intertwined with hope's melodies, creating a symphony of existence that echoed through the ages. His form now resembled a shimmering mirage, an embodiment of the very essence he sought to cultivate, a reflection of the world itself, constantly shifting and changing as he molded it into something new. The entity within him hummed its approval, a chorus of sorrow transformed into a symphony of hope. This wasn't the end of his transformation, but only the beginning, an ongoing symphony of existence, forever in balance. The world had been reshaped. Elias didn't rule it anymore. He merely guided it, a conductor leading a symphony. Shadows and light danced together in an intricate ballet of emotion, their movements echoing through every living soul, from the smallest ant to the towering mountain range. It was not a perfect harmony yet. There were still discordant notes, lingering echoes of past sorrows that refused to fade away. But Elias understood. He saw it as a work in progress. He wasn't just an architect of empathy, but a shepherd for those lost souls who still clung to darkness. He guided them towards the light with gentle whispers, shared moments of solace and understanding, and even allowed their sorrows to be woven into this tapestry of hope. He understood that true balance was not about extinguishing grief entirely. It was about recognizing its presence as an integral part of a richer tapestry. And through his work, Elias began to see something more profound than mere harmony. He witnessed the birth of genuine compassion. He saw families embracing their loved ones' grief with understanding and tenderness, saw communities building support systems for those struggling with loss, saw individuals finding solace in shared experiences that transcended individual pain. The entity within him pulsed with a contentment Elias had never felt before. It was no longer driven by its own sorrow, but a new melody, a song of purpose, of love, and a profound understanding that the world needed more than just strength to overcome darkness. It needed the beauty of empathy and compassion. He knew then he was not destined to rule. He was meant to be a mentor, a guide, a conductor of hope in a symphony of pain. As Elias watched this transformation unfold, a profound peace settled over his being. He understood that true power wasn't about dominance, but about understanding, the ability to perceive and respond to the world's complexities with empathy. He was no longer bound by the darkness within him. He was now a vessel of light, an embodiment of shared sorrow transformed into something beautiful. One day, he found himself standing on the edge of a vast meadow, bathed in the soft glow of sunset. Sarah's image shimmered before him, her form radiating warmth and comfort. She no longer resembled just a reflection. She was now a physical manifestation of his compassion, an echo of hope that refused to be silenced. "We have done well," she whispered, her voice a soothing melody that echoed through the twilight. "This world has been reshaped into something beautiful." The entity within him hummed in agreement, its somber tones finally turning to music. And Elias knew he had found his purpose, not as a ruler or a destroyer, but as a shepherd of hope and a champion of empathy. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, basking in the glow of this newfound harmony, a symphony that echoed the very essence of existence itself. The world had been reshaped, not by force, but by the understanding and acceptance of both light and shadow. The shadows remained. They were no longer to be feared or shunned. They were simply another aspect of life's intricate tapestry, woven into its beauty. He smiled at Sarah and whispered back, "This is just the beginning." The world was still a symphony, forever in progress. Its melody now resonated with hope, acceptance, and understanding, an eternal ballad that Elias would continue to play alongside the entity within him, a reminder that even in darkness, there existed a potential for both beauty and grace. His reign wasn't about control anymore. It was about nurturing a world where grief could blossom into a symphony of resilience and hope. And that melody, he knew, would forever echo through the ages, reminding all souls that even amidst the shadows, there was always room for light to bloom.